Hello, beautiful people, and welcome.
Hi. To, I guess, the first non-guide TCG video after the release of the TCG. In the last TCG video, the Yoimiya Ayaka guide, I talked at the beginning of the video about how it's pretty difficult because it's a very new game to have people you can fact check with, and that makes it so that my information, as much as I want it to be as good as possible, I'm not too confident about a lot of the things I say. That being said, in order to try to remedy that to some extent, for this video I've decided to invite SI, or Robot Wiz, or Stupid Idiot. He goes by a bunch of different names on different platforms to help me out with basically what we're going to be doing is talking about the top 5 most overrated and underrated cards in the TCG right now.
Hello, I'm Stupid Idiot. I've been doing a bunch of pre-release TCG stuff, or I guess post-release TCG stuff as well. You may have seen me around. I'm currently TC staff at the discord.gg/invocation, our TCG server, and the creator of GenshinCards.com. I also went to 5-0 in the first NA tourney, so I guess you could trust me a little bit on what I'm about to say here.
The only one to go 5-0 in NA so far. Gonna participate in every tournament and never lose, right?
Surely.
So let's basically just get right into it. We're gonna start with the most overrated cards. And at number 5, we're going to have weapons in general, and more specifically, Aquila Favonia.
Yeah.
Weapons in general are very, very slow, and the fact that they cost 3 white dice, right? So it has to be of the same element, makes them a lot harder to play because very often you want to play a weapon and then use something, which means you're going to need a bunch of dice of your element. The thing is, if you don't have like a lot of Omni dice, let's say you end up with 3 Pyro and then a bunch of other dice, but none of them are 3 of the same element. You have 3 Pyro to use your elemental skill on Bennett, for example, but then you can't tune a Dendro to get to 3 Dendro if you have like 2 Dendros, for example. You have to tune to Pyro, which means that if you want to use your Bennett skill and Aquila Favonia, you have to tune 3 whole cards for it, because tuning can only get you the like active character. That makes it so that the weapon cards are somewhat often going to end up just being completely unplayable from your hand if you don't get good dice.
Yeah, I think in general, a lot of cards that cost 3 white, even and also some of the constellation cards that cost 4 white, but they just end up being absurdly difficult to play because you can't really plan around playing these too much, and also, yeah, you can't tune to your active characters, so it gets really awkward trying to play 3 cost.
They need to have a massive upside.
Yeah, Aquila and Wolfscare Stone are on the edge of having that massive upside, but they're still weapons, and I don't think they're particularly good.
Yeah, basically, with Aquila Favonia, if you could have that passive just be permanent, then it would be insane. But the problem is you have to attach it to a specific character, and then a lot of decks have ways of killing one character without that much of a problem. And so if that character dies, or if it's put low and you have to swap out, and you can't go back to them, then you're not getting any value out of your weapon, which is basically the biggest issue with stuff like Aquila Favonia. It only works against decks that don't really have a way to nuke your characters.
Yeah, even past that, you need to get an absurd amount of skills off on a character with a weapon in order to actually generate value off of it. I guess we could look at the 2-cost weapons as a reference for a baseline because they're a little bit easier to calculate, but you need to... Okay, you're playing White Iron Greatsword instead of getting 2/3 of a skill, and every skill does about on average, it goes about on average +4, because it's a deal 3 of some element, so you get 1 elemental application, it's +1, and then 3 damage. So you need to get at least 3 attacks off, 4 attacks off to generate any value whatsoever.
Yeah, for this to be better than just using 1 more skill, basically.
Yeah, and also this costs a card, so it's like...
And just to like elaborate on that, elemental application doesn't directly translate to damage, but it translates to the ability to trigger reactions, and reactions on average are a +2. So each half of the elemental application is worth theoretically about 1 additional damage once it converts to a reaction.
Yeah.
And another big problem with weapons is that there are weapon support cards, but in order for the weapon support cards to be good, you have to run multiple weapons, otherwise they're not going to be consistent enough, right? Because you need to have both the support card and a weapon. But if you run multiple weapons and you draw multiple of them, you can't equip 2 weapons on a character. And so it ends up just leaving you in a situation where
you either have to run like a deck of all the same weapon types, or you're just not running the weapon support at all. And
even if you do run a deck with all the same weapon types, a lot of them are going to end up being bricks in your hand. So let's move on to number 4. The 4th most overrated card goes to Quick Knit. Quick Knit theoretically could be fine, right? It gives you 1 more use to a summon, and there's a bunch of summons that are pretty good. You look at Ganyu's Burst, for example. Ganyu's Burst, deal 1 damage and then 1 piercing to both standby characters, so that's 3 damage. And then plus the Elemental Application, which we've already talked about how that's about 1 additional damage is worth. So that would be 4 additional damage if you get 1 more usage out of it. The problem is you're not getting 1 more usage out of it now. You're getting 1 more usage out of it in 3 turns. And the game's over before that. Very often, it's difficult to cast your high impact summons on turn 1. And if you cast them on turn 2, then they're gonna still deal their damage at the end of turn 2 and then at the end of turn 3. And Quick Knit would basically make them deal damage at the end of turn 4. But the thing is, most games can be over before that. And if they're not, if you're playing against a slow deck, if the deck is slow enough for it to actually get to that point, and they know that they can be weak to summon decks, and they can decide to put Send Off in their deck. And if they do, and you use Quick Knit, you're basically wasting 1 dice for them to use Send Off anyway.
I think in general, when you're seeing meta versus meta, the games are ending on round 3 on average, or in the middle of round 4.
Yeah.
So Quick Knit only ever gets any use at all if you're casting it on a summon you play on round 1. And then if you're using it on a summon you play on round 1, it's okay, but it's still like you're getting 1 extra damage in 2 rounds or whatever. I will say that there's a very good chance the meta slows down a lot when we get Magu's released, because a lot of people want to test Magu, and also he's a summon-based freeze support, which will help slow the game down maybe to round 4 or 5 average. And then Quick Knit might be a little bit better, especially because you want to be keeping your Magu summons around. But as of now, it's pretty bad.
Let's move on to number 3. The 3rd most overrated card, Jade Chamber. The Jade Chamber guarantees dice of a specific element at the start of your round. And that's 2 more dice than you would otherwise get, right? Well, no. Because, you get the animation of all 8 dice going off, but the reality is they're guaranteed before the other die, which means that instead of rolling 8 dice, you have 2 guaranteed and you're rolling 6. So the average amount of good dice that you're getting from those 6 is not actually going to translate to an additional 2 on average. It's going to translate closer to, how much is it again?
1.125 extra. Yeah, that makes sense. Your first roll normally gets you 2, and then your second roll normally gets you 1.5 of a dice you're looking for.
Yes, that's 3.5.
And then in Jade Chamber, it's like you got the average roll during your first reroll, and then you rolled 2 more times. So you get 1.5 and then 1.125.
But yeah, so basically this doesn't translate to actually 2 additional dice. And when you actually look at the distribution for it, it's really not that insane. On top of that, guaranteed dice of your element are good if all you need is dice of your element. But the reality is, at least most teams are going to have multiple different elements, and being forced to swap to the character whose skills you want to use next round isn't great. You'd rather have the flexibility of being able to choose who you actually end on. And if you get guaranteed dice of an element, where you're not actually trying to cast their skills this turn, it really doesn't help you much.
Yeah, if anything, it's making it worse for you because you were guaranteed dice that you don't want.
Yeah, and the more characters of different elements you have on your team, if you're going for resonance, generally you have 2 different elements, and if you're not going for resonance, you'll have 3. The more different elements you have on your team, the worse Jade Chamber becomes, and the better the alternatives to Jade Chamber becomes. We'll talk about the alternative to Jade Chamber a little bit later in this video, but for now, we can move on to number 2, the 2nd most overrated card in the Genshin TCG, which is Strategize! Let me get this out of the way. Pot of Greed, hell yeah. Let me get this out of the way. Strategize is not a bad card. Overrated doesn't mean people think it's insane, but it's actually garbage. Overrated just means people think it's better than it is. I think that people think Strategize is a lot better than it is, but I still think that Strategize is a pretty decent, a pretty solid card that even though you probably, it probably isn't one of the 15 best cards, right? Because you can have 2 copies of each card. It probably isn't one of the 15 best cards that you can put in a bunch of different decks. It's probably in the top, 20, 25 5, and it's definitely in the top 15 for some deck archetypes as well. Strategize is still a pretty decent card, but people treat it like it's as good as Pot of Greed, basically, and it is not. I've talked a little bit about Strategize in my pre-release video, and I've talked about how because it costs 1 die, then it makes it a lot worse than what Pot of Greed is. But people definitely still treat it as, well, I can draw 2 cards for free. And I just don't believe that's the case.
Yeah, it costs a resource, so it's already much worse than Pot of Greed. Like, the reason why Pot of Greed is so good is because there's no reason to not play it. It just gives you an extra card. Strategize, on the other hand, there's plenty of reason to never want to play this card. Costing 1 dice can be a lot. And then there's also the fact that card advantage in general just isn't as impactful in this game.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even know if I could say, I'd say a card could be worth about, on average, 3/4 of a dice. 3/4 of a black dice. I don't know. It's
something like that, yeah.
Strategize never feels good to play, at least.
The kind of decks where Strategize is good is when there's a few cards in your deck that are like actually game changing, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at the Quicken decks, for example, very often Quicken decks will want to start with Oz, swap to Kole, and then either use Kole's skill or play a Paimon and end their turn, or a Liben and end their turn. And that leaves you with 1 spare dice that you can use to play things. And more importantly, if you get Kole's talent card, the Floral Sidewinder, it boosts your win rate a lot.
Yeah.
And so having cards like Strategize that can search for that card while also slotting in very well in the 1 dice, like the 1 spare dice that you have on this turn, is very, very good. Because that's the kind of deck where an effect like this is very valuable.
Yeah, also Resonance decks in general can enjoy having this, because if you draw into one of your Resonance cards, it's very good.
Yeah, if Strategize draws you a Resonance card, it's a 0 cost cycle plus tune, basically.
Yeah.
So the more like specific, very, very strong cards you have in your deck, think Kole's Talent, think a lot of the Elemental Resonances, both the Woven and the other ones, then the more the value of Strategize goes up. But when you're playing a deck that doesn't really have those specific cards, and you're playing a deck that has a bunch of different things they can do in their turn, and they're not relying specifically on 1 combo, then Strategize kind of becomes a card that you actually end up tuning very often.
Often that 1 dice cost for a lot of decks is too much. I think, like, in Ayamiya, I ended up cutting this card already.
Yeah, so have I. In the Ayaka Yuimiya deck, it's just, you have cards that you rely on, but the main one is Minty Meat Roll, and you already have pretty good consistency on getting it if you run NRE. And then other than that, there is Gambler, but even if you don't have Gambler, you can very much still kill your opponent on 3, and spending that 1 dice to get a chance at Gambler is often not going to be as good as spending that dice on...
like getting an extra normal attack in.
Yeah.
Which happens quite often.
So that does it for number 2. So let's now move on to the number 1 most overrated card in the whole Genshin TCG. Catherine. Catherine f***ing sucks.
Yeah.
Okay, let me preface this. There are situations where Catherine is good. Fast actions in general are just very strong. The biggest downside to fast actions is that the situations where they're strong is not always at the start of your turn. And most importantly, the situations where they're strong is mostly when you can surprise your opponent with them. The best use for Catherine is very often just on the turn you play her, and you end up spending 2 dice to get your fast swap.
Even in those situations, Catherine isn't very good, because costing 2 black doesn't let you scale twice.
It's rough, right? Because your swap costs 1, your Catherine costs 2, that leaves you with 5, which is not enough to get 2 skills off. Another thing that can make Catherine pretty bad is that there is some value in going faster, ending your turn first, but if you go too fast, if you end your turn too early, then that lets the opponent still do a bunch of things in their turn, and because you've ended turn, you can't react anymore, right? You look at stuff like in the Ayaka Yoimiya deck, the earlier you end turn, the earlier they can safely swap into their Ayaka and start beating you up. And with the popularity of the Ayaka Yoimiya deck right now, Catherine very often ends up being more of a detriment than an upside.
Yeah, because it's forcing you to end your turn faster.
That being said, there are still situations where Catherine is good. A lot of summon decks like fast actions because it lets you basically guarantee that you end your turn first, which then you have the summon at the end of your turn hitting the enemy, and then at the start of next turn you can trigger a guaranteed reaction that they can't dodge. dodge. I've done a lot of Chongyun, Xiangling, Diluc, where you start on Xiangling, you drop your Guoba, and then either you swap to Chongyun or you end turn directly, and then at the start of next turn, if you've got a fast action, either if you got a fast action on turn 1 to swap to Chongyun, or at the start of the next turn, you swap to Chongyun, you use your Pyro Resonance, which makes your next Pyro reaction deal +3 damage, and you use Chongyun's E. And if you went first, then that means that Guoba hit them for 2, and then your Chongyun E deals 3, so that's 5. It melts, so that's 7, and with Pyro Resonance, that's 10. And that's 10 damage that they basically can't dodge. So Catherine can have some value in decks like that. The problem is that very, very often, well, A, it costs 2, which is very, very expensive to get that, and B, there's generally better options, which we will get to later. So that does it for the top 5 overrated cards. So let's now move on to the top 5 underrated cards. So cards that a lot of people aren't really thinking about too much, that you should. Cards that are very, very good to have. We can start with Knights of Favonius Library.
The better Jade Chamber.
Yes. Let me get this out of the way. I don't think that Knights of Favonius Library is an incredible card. I don't think it's that insane, which is why it's at number 5. What I like about Knights of Favonius Library is that I consider it to just be a better version of Jade Chamber. If you're looking for a specific element, Knights of Favonius Library, like with the extra reroll, like having 1 extra reroll, is actually the exact same average amount of good Omni plus dice of your element as Jade is. The 2 guaranteed dice versus, or the 2 guaranteed dice gets you to about 4.6 average good dice on your turn. The extra reroll also gets you to about 4.6 average good dice. The thing is, A, it's not dice of your active character. It can also be of a different character because you get to choose, right? Because you're the one clicking the dice when you reroll. And more importantly, if you have multiple different skills you want to cast on different characters, then you're looking for 3 different elements. And when you're looking for 3 different elements, the average amount of good dice that you're gonna get with Library is actually higher than it is with Jade. And when it's 4 with, right, because I'm including Omni and like the good elements to get, when it's 4, because you're playing a team with 3 different elements and plus Omni, then Library is just completely, like, it just completely overshadows the Jade Chamber. And then on top of all that, it also gives you a reroll when you play it.
Yeah, there's not a lot of reason to run Jade Chamber over Fab Library, really, except for, I guess, consistency.
Yeah,
but,
with Jade Chamber, you can't get unlucky and have, like, just not get any dice. You're guaranteed to get your 2. The variance is lower. So if you're playing a deck that doesn't actually need elemental dice that often, but they need it for a specific turn and you don't need that many, you just need to make it to guarantee it, then Jade can be fine. But in basically almost every other situation, Library is just better.
Yeah, and it has the extra upside of being able to roll something when it's played. Mm-hmm. So a lot of those decks that want Jade just would enjoy having that upside anyways.
Let's now move on to the number 4 most underrated card, which is Adeptus Temptation, the Adeptusy. During this round, your next elemental burst deals +3 damage. When it comes to like value for your cards and for your dice, having a card that costs 2 and deal 3 damage is pretty fucking good. The downside of Adeptus is that it's conditional and it only works on burst. But the upside of it is that it doesn't show up for your opponent until you play it. And you don't play it until you use it, which means that it's surprise damage. Very often when you have a burst ready, your opponent is going to try to play around it in one of a few ways. Let's say you have your Chongyun burst, it does 7 ready. They can swap to they can just deal damage to your Chongyun except that they're going to die. They can swap to a 2 HP character to make it so that you can't really use your burst without wasting it, or they can swap to a full HP character so that they don't die to Chongyun. Now if they do that, then your Adeptus makes your burst kill them. I'm using Chongyun as an example because I've been running Adeptus with Chongyun pretty often, but he's not the only character this is useful on. Just in general, threatening more damage than what your opponent can expect from what you have on the board is always very, very valuable. With cards like Leave It To Me, which is the Ito card, if a character died this round, you gain 1 dice and 1 energy, being things that you run in almost every deck, being able to have a surprise on a character that doesn't even have their burst ready, to have a surprise like 10 damage, it's very, very valuable. It's really good at disrupting combo decks where they're gonna kill one of your characters, you get your free swap because they're dead, you use your Ito, use your Adeptus, and you just one-shot their main combo piece. But in general, what makes Adeptus really good is basically just having the opportunity for a +3 damage that the opponent opponent isn't expecting.
I haven't been playtesting Adeptus too much, and I'm not sure if I completely agree with Jeff's take on it, but it's definitely, like, I don't see anybody running this card, and it has high enough potential that, like, for all the reasons that Jeff just said, but the card is fine. Definitely should be a consideration in a lot more decks than people ran it for.
I've been running 2 copies of Adeptus in the deck that I was talking about earlier, the Chongyun Sailing Deluge deck, because having the 10 damage on Chongyun is really nice. I've been running 2 copies of it in the Kole Quicken deck because it lets you get to breakpoints a lot more easily, and I've been having a pretty decent amount of success with it, and I think that is just a very underrated card that people should consider a lot more. Let's move on to the next one. Number 3 most underrated card is going to be Toss-Up. However, the thing about Toss-Up is there's actually a very good reason for people to think it's bad. The reason is that the card does not do what it says it does. So my first language is not English, so I've always been confused about dice, whatever. I didn't know, so I was just like, you know what, whatever, I'll just test it and see how it actually works. This should be dice. This is not 1 die that you get to reroll 2 times. This is basically just getting 2 additional rerolls for all of your dice. It doesn't do what it says, it does something a lot better. That leads to a lot of people just being like, okay, well, this looks like shit, so I'm just gonna not play it. When in reality, it is actually a pretty good card. People very often will run the bestest travel companion ever, right? The second Paimon card. And it has situations where it's very good, but there's also a lot of situations where Toss-Up is just a better version of it on average. Obviously, it's RNG, which means that on average doesn't mean that it's always going to be a better version of it. But there's definitely situations where Toss-Up is a very, very strong card that goes overlooked. I imagine partly because it's mistranslated. Namely when, again, right, same situation as J Library, when you're looking for more than 1 elemental type, Toss-Up gives you on average a very good amount of dice. It's just very, very valuable. The more elemental dice types you're looking for, the better on average Toss-Up will be. And also, the unluckier you got with your initial rolls, the more value on average you'll gain out of Toss-Up. Because if you're rerolling 1 dice because you already got 7 good ones, then yeah, I mean, it's rerolling 1 twice, right? And it's pretty bad. But if you got a pretty unlucky hand, or a pretty unlucky dice roll, and you got 1 or 2, and getting Toss-Up on average is going to give you a lot more than Bestest would.
Yeah, and that situation where you got a lot of dice of what you don't want it's a situation where you really need these dice fixer cards in the first place. A lot of the times you could just afford to tune if you just need like 1 or 2 more dice, except for the turns where you completely break on the dice, and then Toss-Up is just like the best card in the game.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, right, if you're playing a deck that wants specific elements, and a lot of them, you want to cast 2 skills on different characters basically every turn, then you're gonna need 6 specific elemental dice, which you get an average before rerolling. How much is it on average?
4.874.
So on average, you're only going to need to tune 1-ish. But relatively often, you're going to get unlucky, right? Because at the end of the day, if you play a bunch of games, sometimes you'll experience being lucky and sometimes being unlucky. And the times you get unlucky, you get 3 die, 2 or 3, instead of the 4.8-ish average. Toss-Up's average result gives you a lot more than Bestest does. And so Toss-Up would be the equivalent of tuning like 3-4 different cards. So you can kind of look at it as a zero cost draw 3-4 cards, which is pretty good.
Yeah, I think what's important is that Toss-Up versus Bestest so for Bestest, if you're looking for 6 dice of the same or of 3 different elements, you get around an 84% chance of doing that. And for 7 dice of 3 elements, it's a 61.5%. Well, for Toss-Up, if you want 6 or more of the same element, it's an 89% chance, which is like a 5% improvement. And then for 7 or more, it's a 65%, which is like what, 3.5%. So these breakpoints of 6 or 7 dice of the same element is where you really want to be at anyways, because that's enough to cast 2 skills. Mm-hmm. And that's when Toss-Up is just
better. Yeah,
it's just better.
But obviously, cards that have variance, right? You'll experience, if you play a lot, you'll experience that variance. Sometimes you'll get unlucky, sometimes you'll get unlucky. But that also means that they can end up feeling worse to play because, well, people have like a cognitive bias where things that make you feel strongly are things that you remember more. And when you get a lucky result, or when you get an average result, you don't really notice it. When you get a slightly above average result, we get 1 additional dice, you don't really notice it. When you get below, you do. When you get below how much you need, it feels really bad. Which means that cards like Toss-Up can end up feeling very bad to play, even if they're actually pretty good. And you can end up underestimating it because it feels worse than it actually is, or it is better than it feels. Let's move on to the second most underrated card. A card that, unlike the other cards that we've talked about so far, right? Toss Up, Adeptus Library. Those are cards that are very, very strong, but they're not necessarily cards you want to put in every single deck. This card, you want to put in every single deck 2 copies of it. Let's talk about Changing Shifts. Changing Shifts is just really good. Effectively, it's a 0 cost, gain 1 elemental die. And as it turns out, that's incredibly good. But on top of that, it can also be a 0 cost, give action over to your opponent in a situation where you don't have a specific thing that you want to do before you see what they're trying to do this turn. Or force your opponent to spend 1 dice swamping. And as it turns out, that's just incredibly strong. Changing Shifts is a card that I run in basically every single deck, and that I would recommend running in every single deck. It's just really, really strong.
Yeah, I was definitely one of the people who underrated this card originally. Just like comparing it to some other cards, it seems not very impactful, but it's often, for one, yeah, in combo, it helps you pass priority to your opponent really easily, and it just straight up ramps you 1 there. But also, it's very often the difference between playing 3 cards, or playing like 2 skills in a card, or getting 3 skills off in a turn versus getting just 2 skills off in a turn. And that's surprisingly actually important breakplay.
Right, because like we talked about earlier when we talked about Strategize, while card advantage isn't useless, it doesn't matter all that much, right? It's not the most important thing, which means that using a card to basically let you play more cards, and yeah, sure, you're playing more cards, so you're losing card advantage, but you're doing more things with it, that's actually pretty good. And that's why Changing Shifts is so strong.
Yeah, if a card can generate you 1 black dice, I think that is already like, it should be an auto include. And Changing Shifts doesn't exactly do that because it forces you to switch a character in order to get the ramp effect, but it's basically that in a lot of decks, and at that point you should just be running the card.
And then finally, the most underrated card in the Genshin TCG. I don't know if I'd call it the best card in the game, but it's definitely up there as one of the best. And it's a card that, while people often know is good, people don't realize just how good it is. Leave it to me! Your next swap is a fast action instead of a combat action. Now you might be thinking, Lejeff, what the f are you talking about? You said that Catherine, who's basically just leave it to me but multiple times, is the most overrated card. How can leave it to me be the most underrated card? This doesn't make any sense! Well, like I talked about with Catherine, fast actions can be good. The biggest issue with Catherine is that it forces you into a fast action, and what makes fast actions good is when you can decide when they happen. You don't always want a fast action at the beginning of your turn. Sometimes that's actually more of a downside than an upside. But getting a fast action whenever you want, especially for 0 dice, that is incredibly good. It lets you set up a lot of stuff that you wouldn't otherwise be able to set up. It lets you play around a lot of counterplay, right? Very often, let's say you're playing the Yoimiya Ayaka deck. A lot of decks have the potential to kind of just run you down on turn 1 and kill your Yoimiya before she gets to cast her burst. Well, okay, you just swap out of her at the end of your turn before ending your round. Okay, cool. And then next round, you just leave it to me, swap back to her and use your burst. And you actually get to cast her burst without her dying, without exposing her to danger. Leave It To Me is a card that people consider to be good. And yet, I still think it's the most underrated card because it's just so much better than you think.
Yeah, again, another card that I underrated a bunch originally. The amount of utility it gives, and yeah, just the amount of utility it gives is insane for a 0 cost card. It helps you get past like almost any counterplays. It gives you like surprise reaction damage for one thing, which is super important. That's like a +2. And then it also gives you counterplay to a lot of stuff, or getting an extra skill off on a character or something that would otherwise just straight up die. That's extremely high value. That's like another like 3+4 effect. Being 0 cost is just for such a strong effect that you can choose whenever you want to do it for surprise or for anti-counter play is just insane.
Yeah. So I think that does it for the most overrated and the most underrated cards in the Genshin TCG. There's a few cards that are incredibly strong or incredibly bad that we haven't really talked about today because the community has a generally accurate perception of it. A lot of the artifact sets are a bit too slow to be very good, but most people seem to have gotten that already. One of the artifact sets, specifically Gamblers, is way too good, but a lot of people seem to have gathered that much already. Lotus Flower Crisp, very, very strong anti-burst card, but again, right, this is a card that's somewhat accurately rated. And I think that it's a little bit more interesting to talk about misconceptions than it is to talk about stuff that you already know, basically. But yeah, so that basically does it for the video. I appreciate you all for watching. If you want to see more of Mr. Stupid Idiot, you can check him out on Twitch at twitch.tv/robotwizhs. Don't forget to use the GenshinCards.com website, which surely is going to be updated regularly and
Yeah.
but do go check him out. I appreciate his help with this. And yeah, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye, YouTube.
Goodbye.